Hey, everybody. Good evening again, everyone, from Bagley, Minnesota, again this time. I'm Pastor Mark Olson, serving Faith Lutheran Church on the kind of the north edge of the White Earth Reservation here. This is session five of our Bible study on the book of Ruth. Last week, you heard me sharing some reflections from my camper, excuse me. Keep thinking of cameras and live streaming and all that. My camper that I parked down at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in the midway of St. Paul. Our world was turned upside down 2 weeks ago on Thursday when that part of St. Paul was looted and there was massive destruction to over 170 businesses in St. Paul, particularly in the Midway area. Grocery stores and pharmacies and businesses suddenly created a food desert, an area of famine, and a Bethlehem, if you will. Bethlehem Lutheran in the Midway opened its doors and gleaned food to meet the needs of the people in that neighborhood. Details on that, I'm not going to really share much of that tonight in this Bible study, but that's going to be really the focus of a PowerPoint that I'm in the process of putting together tomorrow morning, Friday morning. We record that, and it will be available on Faith Lutheran's YouTube channel, and also will be broadcast that sermon, PowerPoint, and worship experience in Garden Valley Television and also Bagley's local cable access channel. So not a whole lot about that tonight, but really I thought it fits well with Sunday's gospel reading of Jesus sending out the 12, the disciples. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. The harvest of wheat, the harvest of Judah, the harvest of Bethlehem. So let's maybe stick more right into the book of Ruth tonight. Last week, the circumstances of Ruth and Naomi, and really the overall narrative of the book of Ruth took a dramatic turn. As it happened, Ruth came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. She had resolved and told Naomi, I am going to go out and glean. I'm going to look in the ancient form of charity. I'm going to look to the corners of the fields and to the when grain would be harvested and wrapped into bundles and stacked. Hebrew law forbade people from picking up the gleanings, the ears of grain that fell to the ground, and those headlands or those corners of the field, to leave those for the poor and the foreigner and the stranger in their midst. So in a sense, Ruth is going out in search of charity. As it happened, Ruth came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. And so suddenly we have this third character in our narrative, Ruth, Naomi, and now Boaz enters the scene, or at least his field for the time being. We'll hear more from him here shortly. And so Ruth speaks to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, and she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind your reapers. And then the servant in charge reports to Boaz regarding Ruth's grit, her determination, and her will to work. And he reports, she came and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. Boaz has already heard about this, Ruth, though, and he speaks protectively and tenderly to her. Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind my workers. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. What is so significant about a man like Boaz who would tell his men not to bother this strange woman? Why would it be necessary for Boaz to go over and talk to his young men, his workers, and order them, hey guys, don't bother her? What in the world would make it possible that they would bother her in the first place? Dr. Catherine Sakenfeld writes in her commentary on Ruth, quote, Boaz's command to the young men not to bother Ruth could be translated, do not molest her. It is quite possible that any young woman working alone in the fields might be subject to unsolicited advances by men in the area. The risk of such advances would doubtless be greater in cases where it was known that a woman had no male protector. A foreigner from a disliked ethnic group would be even more likely to be victimized. End quote. And for her part, Ruth, at times such as this, at times of such great desperation, was well within her right to play the role of a prostitute. In the Augsburg Fortress commentary that I know some of you have ordered from Diane Jacobson, she writes about the various categories of the needy in the time of this story. She writes, Ruth is a foreign widow with neither a father nor a husband to care for her. She was perhaps 24 to 26 years old, having been married for 10 years before her husband died. She would have been considered unsuitable for marriage, particularly at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, backing up, we remember perhaps that Ezra and Nehemiah and the book of Deuteronomy had strict provisions on Jews marry Jews, Hebrew people stay to their own ethnic group, and even in Deuteronomy that Moabites would be forbidden from the temple, or if a Jew married a Moabite, them and their children, their descendants would be forbidden. She would have been considered unsuitable for marriage, particularly at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, is Ruth, the book of Ruth, being written as a contrasting narrative to Deuteronomy, Ezra and Nehemiah? Lots of people think yes, that was the point. Going on in Jacobson's commentary, she would have the option of being a prostitute. This would have been legitimate because her sexuality was not owned by a father or a husband. All of these factors or predetermined categories would have brought a great deal of suspicion by the upright citizens of Bethlehem. Boaz is one of those upright citizens, and yet he looks with favor upon Ruth. Turn my page on way. Ruth is protected by Boaz. Boaz answered her, all that you have done for my mother-in-law, that's Naomi, since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. Then she said, may I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants. Boaz is coming across this cataclysmic, this wide, gaping area between the races of the Moabites and the Jews, and welcoming Ruth into his protection. Oh, hi, Ronnie. Good to see you. And thanks for joining our Bible study tonight. Again, Dr. Sakenfeld in her commentary says that Boaz has already heard, presumably through the Bethlehem grapevine, all about Ruth's situation. Last week we read about how when Naomi and Ruth really come limping into the city of Bethlehem, the house of bread, their lives have been undone. They're devastated, and And Naomi says, I went away full and I've come back empty. And the people of the village say, is this really Naomi? Her face is now gaunt. Her hair is turned gray. Her face has carried the cares and the concerns and the loss and the grief of 10 years to the point that she's almost not recognizable. And then she has this foreign woman alongside her, this Ruth, who is a stranger indeed. Um, as Boaz speaks of what Ruth has done for Naomi, his words develop a direction on Ruth's insistence of sticking to Naomi. Certainly, Boaz's words suggest that he views Ruth's behavior as exceptional. Exceptional indeed. Again, Ruth is regarded in the annals of Jewish thought as this foreigner who comes to Yahweh as even greater than Abraham, because Abraham at least had God speaking to him and say, go and leave Ur of the Chaldees, and I promise that your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. Ruth never gets the vision, but her loyalty and her fidelity to Naomi and her love is enough. And then Boaz, this Jewish nobleman, prays for Ruth, prays for this woman who could just as well be a prostitute wandering in his fields for all he knows. The man in the story, the upright citizen, the helpful protector, the unmarried landowner, prays for the beggar, for the woman who could so easily fall into that category of prostitute, this Moabite foreigner. And he prays, may the Lord, may Yahweh, Israel's God, the Hebrew God, may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord your God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. That image of refuge, of protection. And every once in a while, the wings of an eagle in the Psalms carry through. God's wings begin to look a lot like Bethlehem's wings here, Boaz's wings. Chapter 2, we move on to verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to Ruth, come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. He heaped up for her parched grain. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young man, let her glean among the standing sheaves. Standing sheaves now, not just gleaning on the grain that's fallen to the ground. Let her glean among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also put out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Now again, normally the gleaners would take the seeds that have fallen to the ground and the uncut stalks that grew in the headlands, as we sometimes call them now in our fields, or in the corners of the fields. But Boaz is saying, let her glean in the standing sheaves, and cut and pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles that you cut. Twice more Ruth has been blessed. First, at mealtime, Boaz serves her more than she can possibly eat. And then he secondly gives her enough grain to take home. Ruth's gleanings amount, again, according to Sakenfeld, Ruth's gleanings amount to about an ephah of unhusked grain at the end of the day. This amount, about 42 quarts of grain, could feed two people for 5 to 7 days, she writes. Now, we're going to enter into a little bit of a conversation about, is this God's providential care for Ruth and Naomi? Is this God's act, or is this that grit and that determination of Ruth. First, I'm going to go out and glean. I'm going to stay on my feet, and I'm going to work all day. I'm going to show this head of the laborers that I'm here to work. Catherine Sakenfeld, who I've used quite often in her commentary, is a Presbyterian. She's ordained as a teaching elder, was ordained in 1970, went to Princeton and Harvard and other bastions of the Reformed tradition. The Reformed theologians followed the Westminster Confession, and particularly the doctrine of God's providence. The first article in the doctrine of providence is quite long, but this is the first of, I think it's 6 petitions on God's providential love. God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least, and by his wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge, God makes things turn. In a Presbyterian worldview, that abundance of wheat that Ruth receives and brings home to Naomi is nothing less than God's providence. Sakenfeld writes, and this is just right down that Reformed theology. God has surely shown kindness. In the providence of God, God has come into the field that belonged to Boaz. Ruth's choice of location was indeed due to providence, not chance. Likewise, it was by God's providence, not mere chance, that Boaz came to the field and saw Ruth there. Now, certainly, when we look at the salvation history of Israel leading up to the time of David and then on to Jesus, Bethlehem is the city of David. It is the house of bread. It is also the birthplace of Jesus. Particularly in Matthew's gospel, in the first chapter, in the genealogy and the salvation history that leads to the birth of Jesus, Ruth is named. Okay, so there's certainly biblical warrant to say yes. This act of going and following into the favor of Boaz and his field is providential. But I don't want to just simply say it's all the turnings of God in some sort of vast clockwork and gears that fit together. I also want to say that there's a certain amount that we have to look at upon Ruth's human agency, Ruth's grit as well. About 15 years ago, in the spring of the year, I was serving Hope Lutheran Church in Walker. I'd been there only for a year or two, I suppose. And my wife Sarah and I had purchased some land south of Park Rapids. We had it sheared off, and we talked to Kyle Duclos, a biology teacher, about having his class come out and help us plant that those sheared areas in that field in Norway pines, red pines. He said, great. So we made a donation to the school, helped them get some new microscopes and that. And in exchange, the school put together a bus, and that advanced biology class came out and spent the class day in May, planting trees. I rode with Kyle and the students from Walker so they could find where the areas was that we were planting. And they grabbed planting bars and 5-gallon buckets full of seedlings, and we began planting. My mom was still alive at that time. Mom and Dad came out. They'd gone to Subway in Park Rapids and picked up those long Subway sandwiches. We had a delightful lunch, and kids were just great. They were, I think probably it was May, and they were glad to be out of the classroom for a day. But in the midst of the day, the clouds to the west kept getting heavier and heavier, and every once in a while we'd feel a drop of rain. And there was just this feeling in my heart is, oh no, don't let it rain yet. Don't let it rain, because all of a sudden all the kids will rush into the bus and we'll be left with all these seedlings and nobody to help us plant. And lo and behold, with the rains held off. And as the day drew to a close and it was time for the students to get back on the bus and drive back to Walker, I got on board and sat down next to Katie Berry. Katie was a member at Hope Lutheran. Katie's married now and has kids. But at the time, she was just a student, and I think she was even a ninth grader. And so I was sitting next to Katie on the bus. And as we got on the bus, the skies opened up and the rain fell. And if you've ever planted trees, you want those roots wet right away. You want good rain to help those roots catch so that they don't dry up in that dry soil when you plant them in the ground. And so I turned to Katie and I said, Katie, if we were Presbyterians, if we were Baptists, is probably what I said, we would look upon this rain as the providential gift of God. God has seen fit to look upon the laborers of our hands in this field and has sent this quenching rain upon our work as a sign and a testimony of his love. But you know what, Katie? Since we're Lutherans, you know what we believe? We just got really lucky. That's kind of a difference, and I'm not going to say that that Ruth is just simply lucky and that God's providential hand isn't upon this story. But I think it's always we always have to be careful when we assign God's judgment or God's favor on human actions without enough evidence to confirm that. We look upon somebody with a perfect family and the white picket fence and a life of perfection, and we say, oh, God must have blessed them. They have fallen under the providence of Almighty God because they are just so good. And then when we look upon somebody who has suffered from cancer or from loss or from divorce or some other tragedy, it can be so easy to say, well, that person must have sinned, or somebody before that person sinned for such awful things to have befallen them. As Lutherans, we believe rather in the theology of the cross. Again, in the Augsburg commentary, for those of you who have it on this Ruth study, can find this passage and look it up on your own. But Diane Jacobson writes, Scripture taken as a whole points us to a God who works through suffering rather than through glory, rather than through that white picket fence and the circular driveway and the nice car. God works through suffering rather than through glory. This is often referred to as the theology of the cross, which is about telling the truth and living the truth. Is it about calling things what they are and about finding God and God's hidden truth under their opposite? It is thus always about naming suffering, calling it what it is. We get to the truth through the cross, never by going around it. It doesn't mean that we glory or gloat in our suffering. We don't stare into the abyss, as one of my professors said about Friedrich Nietzsche, until it winks back at us. We can fall in love with our sufferings. I've had suffering in my life, as probably many of you have had. Thank you very much. I don't want any more than I have to, but I know it's a reality. And while I would never want to go into some of the dark corners that life has taken me in the past, I do know, as we'll hear in our second lesson on Sunday, that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope doesn't disappoint us. Don't tell that to somebody when they're in the throes of suffering, by the way. It is really only something that makes sense on the other side. But I know, at least for me, those words from Romans chapter 5 give me great strength. We're about ready to wrap up here. So Ruth comes to Naomi's place where they're sheltering, and she's got this grain, an ephah of grain. What did I say? 42 something or others. Food for 5 to 7 days. Are they lucky? Has God's providence shown upon them? Ruth, her mother-in-law, said to Naomi, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." And then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" All my harvest. See, this is the beginning of the harvest, and the harvest will extend for some time. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The end of the harvest. So and somewhere I read this, it's like 4 to 6 weeks of, or 8 weeks of what you have the wheat harvest, and then you have the barley harvest, or the barley harvest and then the wheat harvest. And so Naomi and Ruth have fallen into a substantial place of protection for a matter of a month and a half, 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at the longest. But now, as next week we enter into chapter 3, that limited time of charity, that limited time of falling under the protection of Boaz is soon to end. And Naomi, as we'll find out next week, comes up with a plan and a move from charity to a more sustainable future. In the situation that we're facing in St. Paul right now, in Minneapolis, in any place where Black, Indigenous, people of color are at a disadvantage, we are looking not just at charity, but justice. Like I said, and what you saw last week when I was down in the midway of St. Paul, we're doing some wonderful things to bring bread to people that have suddenly found themselves in a famine with 170 businesses closed. No way to get pharmaceuticals, diapers for children, formula for babies, all sorts of different needs. And so just like Ruth and Naomi in the movement from the second and third chapter, where they're looking for a more sustainable future, we are looking for a more sustainable future for all God's people, whether they're Moabite or Jew, Native American, African American, the people, and many of the people who are coming in search of food at Bethlehem in the Midway and St. Paul are Hmong or Karan, Southeast Asian groups. In fact, when we had to shut down because we had a positive COVID test. By the way, I had a COVID test and it came back negative. Found out today, don't have the coronavirus, thank God. Anyway, I'm thinking about going back down there after we record tomorrow. One of the things that we're really looking at working on is that movement from charity to justice. Javen Swanson is one of the chaplains that I worked with while I was down at Bethlehem. And he wrote in a blog about the steady stream of cars that pulled up to the curb outside of Bethlehem in the Midway, where a swarm of volunteers unloaded donations of groceries, household supplies, and personal hygiene products, which were carried into the church, sorted and packed into bags to be distributed to the hungry neighbors waiting in a long line to receive whatever was available. By the way, one day we had 970 volunteers that helped with that gleaning process. 630 one day, 570 another, just a constant group of volunteers, and so many countless others that drove around the block. And I would show them, drive over there, and I'd give them a slip of paper. If you would share this with your friends on social media, this is a way that they can donate as well. Javen Swanson goes on, seeing what was going on at Bethlehem warmed my heart. But if I am honest, it also made me angry. Why is it that we feel so good collecting donations of groceries to give to people in need, but don't feel outraged that so many in our community are too poor to buy groceries for themselves? Why don't we show up in such force at the Capitol or City Hall to demand a living wage and stronger social safety nets? Well, Bethlehem has now ceased operations. Hopefully we get that going together. Has ceased operations. Poverty in our communities remains, as does the need for us to wrestle with these questions and continue to working for justice. So gleaning, in the example of Ruth and Naomi, is a stopgap measure. It's charity. It serves a need for now. Justice is about long-term solutions and social change. Gleaning or charity is private. It helps in individual acts. Justice is public. It leads us towards collective actions together. Charity responds to the immediate need that the folks are hungry. Justice is about responding to long-term needs. Charity is about a direct service. Justice is about social change. Charity, or gleaning, if you will, is about food and shelter and clothing, a food shelf, if you will, clothing distribution. Long-term solutions is about changing institutions. Charity requires repeated actions. Justice resolves structural problems, structural injustice. Charity is directed at the injustice and attends to the symptoms. Justice or social change is directed at the root causes of this in society. Again, Sakenfeld writes, Naomi develops a plan to arrange for her and Ruth's long-term security, hoping to end to the stopgap survival represented by gleaning. It's the same thing we're looking for at Bethlehem in the Midway. Some of the same things we're looking at on the northern edge of the White Earth Reservation in Bagley. Justice demands more than just donations, as necessarily and as needed as those are today. Next week, I invite you to read Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. And here's a couple of things to do devotionally. Maybe find a photo of yourself at a different time in your life. Have a conversation with that person from that place. And think of a challenging time in your life. Write or journal or compose a psalm or a poem, if you will. And how did God lead you through that moment? Spend some time reflecting on your own experiences, sometimes in the margins, in the gleaning places, in the edges of the field. I think it's in the margins that God shows up more and more. I've come to believe that about my walk of faith and walking with others to a brighter and a more hopeful future. Let us close in prayer. Gracious and holy God, we come to you in these difficult times. And we hear about Bethlehem and the house of bread and the security and the protection of that city, where the city of David, the city of Ruth and Naomi, um, the city of Jesus' birth, homeless on the night of his birth. You show up on the margins of our society in the places of great need. We ask you tonight to show up again and be with us in this difficult time of global pandemic of coronavirus, the violence caused by the murder of George Floyd. Help us to see a better future and help us work collectively to change those barriers and divisions that would separate Moabites from Jews or African Americans from Caucasians, St. Paul from Minneapolis, Bagley from Bemidji, from White Earth, and wherever you see that we need to be one. Bless us this night with great vision. Help us to dream good dreams of a hopeful future for all. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. God bless you all.